Hey everybody, we're gonna finish up our notes for the Cold War and the 1950s. Remember, you are responsible for these notes on our test next class, so make sure that you um, are ready for that. We've already gone over most of this slide on the standoff with the Soviet Union. I'm just going to quickly review the first part and then add a couple things at the end. So first of all, we talked about NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, NATO being the democratic countries of the West, which had been formed after World War II. West Germany is going to add itself to NATO. Soviet Union, in response, is going to sign the Warsaw Pact with its satellite countries. So each side is agreeing to protect the countries in each agreement if they are attacked. And you can see the blue countries belong to NATO in the map that's down there, and the red countries belong to the Warsaw Pact backed by the Soviet Union. In the Middle East, we're seeing issues in Iran. The CIA actually engineers a coup in Iran in 1953 that puts the Shah of Iran in power. This is going to lead to decades, it continues today, of issues between the U.S. and Iranians, many of whom are resentful that we staged this coup, and things are clearly not going well between us and Iran today. The Suez Crisis happening on the Suez Canal between the Middle East and Egypt. The Egyptian president basically wants to build a dam on the canal, but British and French business owners actually own that part. And in response, President Nasser of Egypt nationalizes it. The U.S. comes to the aid. The U.S. basically sides with the British and French, refusing to support Nasser. Israel invades. Britain and France come in on their side. But the problem is the U.S. is not going to help with oil supplies to Britain and France, and so they're going to have to withdraw because they need the oil that Egypt is basically controlling the flow of. Eisenhower, because the U.S. is not looking so good in the Middle East, announces the Eisenhower Doctrine in 1957, basically saying that if any Middle Eastern country is threatened by the Soviet Union, by communist forces, we would come to their aid. This doesn't really work because what we start to see spring up is Arab nationalism, and this is going to be an issue that continues even today. OPEC is also going to form at the end of this decade. It forms officially in 1960. Basically, today it has 12 member countries, half of whom are in the Middle East, and they basically help to regulate the price of oil. And this has implications even for the U.S. today, even though we do rely on a lot of our own oil. The worldwide price of oil, as often set by OPEC, becomes important. Eisenhower is easily going to win the 1956 election. He's a Republican running against Democrat Adlai Stevenson again. However, the Republicans are going to lose Congress in this election. We're going to see implications for that in the next lot of notes. The Soviets are going to launch Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2, which is going to make the U.S. nervous. They're going to put Laika, the dog, in Sputnik 2 to see the effect of space travel on living things. She's not going to survive, unfortunately, but this is going to really ramp up the space race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower, in response, is going to establish NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. He's going to direct billions of dollars toward rocket development. And in February of 1958, the U.S. is going to launch our first satellite, Explorer 1. Explorer 1 only weighed 2.5 pounds. You saw a picture of it when we did the agenda last class. It was the background of that, so you can look that up if you need to. But you see the space race really heightening between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The U.S. is also going to establish the National Defense and Education Act, NDEA, in 1958. It's going to authorize $887 million in loans to needy college students and grants, and the point is to improve the study and the teaching of science and language. Programs like this still exist today. As a teacher, there are programs that help pay back college loans if you go into teaching in the sciences or the technologies. There's not a lot out there for social studies teachers, unfortunately, but the goal is to really beef up the number of scientists that we have in this country. And so there are a lot of things out there for students in sciences and technologies even today. And you can see this really starting in the 50s. All right, let's go to what happens as the 50s close out. We're going to see issues in Latin America. A lot of Latin American countries are going to resent the US because we're spending billions of dollars in Europe. Remember, we're coming out of World War II. We have the Marshall Plan that's really helping to revitalize Europe, reconstruct it after it's been destroyed. And in Latin America, they're going to be resentful because we're not giving them any money, but we're perfectly happy and willing to interfere militarily. It happens in Guatemala in 1954. The U.S. ousts a leftist, so more leaning towards communist government in Guatemala in 1954. Really going to become ominous in Cuba. Since the 1930s, Cuba had had a dictator. Batista is his last name. That's a picture of him on Time magazine. And Washington had actually supported him. In 1959, Fidel Castro is going to lead a revolution in Cuba, and it's going to end up overthrowing Batista. Castro is not happy with American intervention. He doesn't want the U.S. involved, and he's going to start confiscating American properties in Cuba. Washington is going to respond by cutting off Cuban sugar imports. We've seen this before in the Spanish-American War. It's not going to have the same effect this time. Castro is not going to back down. And so anti-Castro Cubans are going to start fleeing to the U.S. That's why we have such a large Cuban population in Florida even today. Washington, in response, is going to cut off diplomatic relationships with Castro's government early in 1961 and impose a trade embargo on Cuba. That embargo is still in effect today. It's been relaxed in the last few years. In July of 2015, we restored some diplomatic relations with Cuba by reopening the U.S. Embassy there. And then in March of 2016, President Obama relaxed two embargo provisions. One that had heavy restrictions on travel to Cuba, so it's easier to travel to Cuba. It's still not super easy, but it's easier, and allowing for a little bit more commerce between the two countries. But there's still heavy embargo on Cuban products coming into the United States or what we are willing to send there. There are two sides to this debate, as there are in most debates. Nothing's ever black and white. Some people say we should continue the embargo against Cuba because Cuba has not made any changes. They haven't moved toward democracy, and there's still many human rights abuses in Cuba. The other side, people say, yeah, but it's been 50 years and the embargo hasn't worked. It's just a relic from the Cold War. Shouldn't we try to get in there and by establishing relationships and helping our economies and people of both countries, then trying to make change democratically. So certainly it's a big debate even today. Once the U.S. cuts Castro off, he's going to turn to the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, who is in control of the Soviet Union at this time, he's perfectly happy to come 90 miles from the U.S. and help the government there. And so that's why Cuba is communist even today. And we're going to see some issues with this in our next unit when we talk about what happens with President Kennedy and Cuba and Khrushchev and missiles. So Eisenhower is going to close out this decade. He seems to get better with age. He is a very dignified, decent, sincere person. He was, however, more vigorous and aggressive in his leadership policies during the last 2 years in office. In those last 2 years, he vetoed 169 bills. Remember, the Democrats were in control of Congress, and only 2 of those vetoes were overturned. The U.S. is very prosperous during Eisenhower's presidency. We have our last 2 states come in. Alaska and Hawaii become states when Eisenhower's president. The St. Lawrence Seaway opens the cities of the Great Lakes to the ocean while he's president. We have the interstate highways that we've talked about before. A lot of people, though, see his biggest flaw as the fact that he did not make a lot of changes in civil rights. There's 2 sides to that as well. He was faced with a Democratic Congress, and at that time, the South was very pro-Democratic, and they were not, those Southern congressmen were not willing to go along with heavy civil rights legislation. In a lot of ways, they're led by the future President Johnson, who does have presidential ambitions. He's from Texas. He doesn't want to make Southerners mad, and so he blocks a lot of what Eisenhower wants to do. Eisenhower does have some successes, however, in civil rights. He sent the Civil Rights Act of 1957 to Congress. It was designed to protect voting rights, especially in the South. It ends up being weakened by the Democrats, but there are some things that passed that are still in effect today. And this was the first civil rights legislation since 1875. So this is a huge thing for him. We still have a Civil Rights Commission and a Civil Rights Division as part of the Justice Department, and their job is to investigate especially voting irregularities based on race and other civil rights issues that come up. Eisenhower wanted to do more to force school desegregation because this is after Roe v. Wade. Not Roe v. Wade, I'm sorry. Brown versus the Board of Education is decided in this decade as well. He wants to do more to force Southern schools to integrate. He is responsible for sending federal troops to allow the Little Rock Nine to go to school as well. And so you really see him trying, but he is up against this Democratic majority that's going to do everything they can to stop him. A huge success of Eisenhower's is his military restraint. Remember, he's a general. He knows what war is like. He was there during World War II. He basically is able to use foreign policy and diplomacy to guide us towards peace rather than war. He ends the Korean War, and he keeps us out of other wars. So he does have a very strong legacy today. So that ends our discussion of the 1950s and our beginnings of our discussion on the Cold War. Obviously, we're going to come back to some of these topics in our next few units. But that is all for now. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.